everybody, and welcome to Skrrt Garage. My name is Connor, and today I'm going to be reviewing this, a 2008 Lexus ISF. And before I get started with this video, I have to mention that this car came out in what I refer to as the golden era. It's my favorite era of cars. It's the cars that were produced between 2005 and 2015, and you can give or take a couple years there, but I just love those cars. For whatever reason, to me, that's ultimately when the engineers were able to maximize the amount of power that they could get out of their engines and their I guess drivetrain packaging, while still having that old school analog hydraulic steering feel. And I just love that. If you compare these cars, the ones I'm talking about, 2005 to 2015, to the cars that came out in the 70s, you'll get a better idea as to what I'm saying. For example, the 1970 big block Chevelle, that was a 454 cubic inch engine, which is a 7.4 liter engine, and that car barely made 390 horsepower. Here you have a E90 M3 with great analog hydraulic steering, and yet it's still making 420 horsepower with dang near half the amount of liters of engine displacement. See why I'm saying that this is kind of the golden era? And that era really did have some all-stars. It had this, the Lexus ISF, it had the C63 AMG, it had the E90 BMW M3, and of course we also had the Audi RS4. And of all those cars, on paper, the ISF was a little bit misunderstood, and that's why I named this video Misunderstood Muscle, because if you want an Autobahn missile, you buy the C63. If you want a car that can dance around a racetrack, you buy the M3. If you want a car that can go up snowy mountains, you buy the Audi. So where does that leave this car? Well, today, guys, we are going to find out. So sit down, strap in, and let's go. The first thing I want to talk about, guys, is the daily drivability of this car. And the reason why I want to talk about it is because when this car was launched, when any new car is launched, what gets tested? Their performance, their limit handling, and stuff like that. What does not get tested is real world, long-term use of a car. And so that is something that this car is far better, far better than any of the other options. And what I'm going to do right now to explain that difference is talk about a couple of the cars. For example, we'll start with the E90 M3. I love that car. I love BMWs. I've had a bunch. I've had C63s. I've had most of the competitors of this car. So let me start with that one, the E90 M3. The E90 M3, when it came out, had a block that was used when BMW was doing their Formula One adventure. And so it was this kind of high-strung, high-performing track driving car that you could drive on the street and also show up to the racetrack and do really well. And when new, with the warranty, that's gonna wow a lot of people. But outside of the warranty, we're starting to see all the downsides of that high-strung engine. Namely, we're getting rod bearings replaced on those cars as a regular maintenance interval. And I think, honestly, guys, if I had to pin it on something, I would say that it probably has to do something with the oil that's used in that car. That car runs on 10W60. 10W60, that's gotta feel like molasses coming out on a cold start, and 60 weight is so heavy, surely that creates a crazy amount of warm-up time before you can actually drive the car. And lo and behold, it does. I talked to an owner, and he has to wait between 20 to 30 minutes before his car is completely up to the operating temperature, where he has full right to absolutely hoon the car. And considering that the average American commute in a car is about 25 minutes, there's probably never a chance where you can really punch a car, especially if you have a low or small commute, you're probably not going to get the opportunity to push that car all that often, even though it is this very special race-derived package. So where does that leave you? Well, it leaves you with a car that could be driven every day but doesn't like to be. Let's move on to the C63. I love the C63 AMG. I've had one, technically two, and even that car, ironically, both the C63 and the E90 M3, both of those cars won International Engine of the Year 2 years in a row. But even the C63, that car is also a race-derived engine. So if you don't absolutely flog the car, the lifters will get blocked and your cams will smack up against them and it'll create a ton of wear, which could necessitate new lifters and new camshafts and adjusters, and that is not cheap. And guys, as I'm telling you this, you might realize that for every metric you gain in limit handling and track driving prowess, you lose in daily drivability. And unfortunately, guys, auto journalists and magazines, they don't have a metric for daily drivability, which is a shame because this car would win it. In 2008, when this car came out, it had a backup camera, 4 doors with a $20 little dongle. You can have Bluetooth that streams and there's no static or there's no interference. It has park assistance. It has all these comfort features that make your daily commute so much easier. And the most important one is that when you turn the car on, you can drive it. And this car, guys, this car feels like any other Lexus or Toyota. You can wake up on a cold morning and you can turn the car on, wait a couple minutes and drive to work. And you don't have to be worried that you're pushing the car too hard before the oil's warmed up, or heaven forbid, get tons of carbon buildup like these C63s do. The more I look at this car, the more I think that this car, when it came out, is kind of like the iPhone. For whatever reason, there are Android users that will tell you, oh, well, this is 10 times better because our tech is newer and we've got bigger processors and whatever, and that's fine. But the fact of the matter is, guys, the iPhone is just easy to live with, and that's kind of like this car. It might not have the best tech, it might not have the most horsepower, but the reality is it's just easy to live with, and that's worth something, especially on down the road when you don't have to spend millions of dollars on maintenance costs. And let me bring that up real quick. When I have friends that ask me, hey, what car should I get? I'm looking in this price range. If the Lexus ISF is on their radar, then I can comfortably tell them, if your budget is 30 grand, you can spend pretty close to your budget. You might be able to spend your 28,000 and just keep 2,000 left over for maintenance repairs, or maybe even less, maybe 29,000, keep 1,000 left over for maintenance repairs. Because this car is so reliable, they're not gonna need to spend or shell out or take out a second mortgage to pay for all the maintenance that this car could incur. But guys, I don't want to talk purely about how economical or easy this car is to live with, because at the end of the day, it is a sports car. So let's talk about how this thing actually feels dynamically. To do that, we can put the transmission into manual mode. Once you slide it over, you have full control, and you have to be the one to shift up because it won't do it for you. It'll just bounce off the rev limiter. Also, we're going to turn on the sport button right here, and we're going to see how this car feels. Well, first off, I will say this. The steering feels good. There's a natural weight. The steering wheel, it's a good size. It's not too big, like height and length wise, and the actual grip of it isn't too fat either. Some cars these days are coming out with wheels that are so fat it feels like you're grabbing a pool noodle, which thankfully this is just kind of the right size. Also, these paddles, they have like an aluminum finish to it. It feels really nice. Now, seating position, I don't like the seating position that much. I have to be honest. These seats, they feel like lazy boys. They're super comfortable and they actually have good bolster support, but you feel like you're kind of always riding on top of the car. You don't feel like you're really sunk that low down into the car, and I do wish that they could do something about that. As far as the power, it's very ample is a great way of saying it. It's not out of control. It does feel like the car can hook up, so it uses all of the power that it has. pretty cool. There's this little beep that pops up right around like 62, 6300 RPM that warns you, hey, it's time for you to shift. If I had one bone to pick with this car dynamically, it's really just that unless you floor it, the car is kind of asleep. And on the flip side, that makes it an amazing daily driving sports car, but it does take away some of the specialness of the platform, the big V8, the huge induction sound that this car can offer. Let's talk a little bit about the things that annoys me about this car, because I do daily drive it and there are some things that annoy me. First off, the steering wheel. While I love the, I guess, size of the steering wheel and the grip of the steering wheel, but what I don't like about the steering wheel is that it doesn't come out very far. I'm not a tall guy, definitely not. I'm 5'11", and this thing, I like having wheels a little bit closer to me. And for whatever reason, this thing doesn't extend very much. It's extended all the way. And for me, it's livable, I can do it, but if you're over 6 foot and you wanna be close to the wheel to kind of get that sports car feel, your knees are gonna be the ones that is gonna have to sacrifice a little bit. The second thing I don't love about this car is where the sport button is at. If I have the steering wheel straight, and I'm looking dead at it, you cannot see the sport button. You have to know that it's hiding over here. There are two kind of toggle switches right here next to the start stop button. And literally guys, if I do this and if I do this, I can't see it at all. I have to come to the side to know where it's at. And with time, you get a sense and you know, oh, it's a little toggle, you push up on it and it turns it into sport mode, but it's just bizarre. I think the first time I rode in this car, I literally couldn't find it for like a couple minutes because I kept looking in the modes and on the steering wheel. And speaking of the steering wheel, I think Lexus realized that the position of it was not very good, because from 2010 on, the sport button actually got moved to the steering wheel itself. The last annoying feature, I'll go ahead and tell you while I'm just sitting here, is the central nav system. The central nav system, again, for a 2008 car, it's actually really nice. It's got a lot of good features that you would like as a daily driver. But what I don't like is that every time you turn the car on, it defaults to the nav, which on this car is a bright white. And so when I get in this car at 6:30 in the morning to go to work, every single time it defaults to this very bright white screen, and it's really bright when you're driving down the road. And you guys might be thinking, oh, well, just turn the dimness down so it's not so bright. If you do that, then it's too dim during the daytime. And so what I end up having to do every single time is I hit the climate button, because the climate button switches everything to this dark font, and it's actually really dark. So in the morning, it doesn't blind you, and it's really easy to drive to and from work without being blinded. Again, is this a big deal? Absolutely not, but it's something that I've noticed in my daily driving of this car. Okay, now it's time to talk about 3 things I like about this car. Well, first off, the brakes on this thing are huge. It's 3-piston front Brembos and 1-piston rear Brembo brakes, and they are massive. The previous owner of this car used to actually track it, so he put twin disc rotors, and this thing stops so good. It stops better than my M2. It stops better than the majority of the sports cars I've owned, which is crazy because this is actually kind of a porky car. It weighs 3,800 pounds. And so for it to be able to stop so well is actually really impressive. Okay, let's move on to number 2 of the things I like. And I'm gonna call it VTEC for Lexus, because if you are in 3rd gear and you're cruising at 2,000 RPM, by the time you get to 3,500 RPM, the secondary intake opens up, and it feels like a new ECU kind of remap or cam positioning, or I don't really know how they do it, but the car wakes up. So I'm gonna see if you can hear it. Nothing, nothing, nothing. Open. And it's kind of bizarre because it only opens once you get past 3,500 RPM. Honestly, guys, I really wish it did that all the time because it sounds so good. But what are you gonna do? The caveat of the car really waking up at 3,500 RPM is that underneath 3,500 RPM, the car's kind of dead. And it's really weird because you actually have to push on the accelerator pretty hard to make it hold gear and go above 3,500 RPM, at least if you're not in sport mode. If you're in sport mode, it will hold the gears out longer and you can easily jump over that 3,500 RPM range and start to flog the car if everything's warmed up and you're ready. So really just kind of interesting. It makes the driving experience under 3,500 RPM very Lexus-like, very comfortable, and above it, very German-like. It's kind of a unique scenario that this car has to offer. Okay, one of the last really cool points I want to bring up is the transmission of this car. It's a direct shift transmission that is super fast, and it's one of the first 8-speed transmissions ever produced. There are some nuances, I will say that. When you're going like 18 miles an hour, 20 miles an hour, the transmission will shift itself into 4th gear. So when you're leaving parking lots and when you're leaving the neighborhood, sometimes it will gear hunt a little bit. It'll say, oh, do you want 2nd gear? Do you want 1st gear? I don't know what you want. And it'll kind of bounce around a little bit. And that is a little bit frustrating. But what's not frustrating is how fast it can shift. Watch this. What's really impressive about this car is you can really wind it all the way out to 6,800 RPM and shift right at red line, and it will give you the next gear immediately, which is really, really impressive because the cars that this thing competed against, not many could do that. None of them actually had the duality of this, where you could be easy going, kind of comfortable, and then also at the same time shift extremely fast. So I will say, for the time, this is remarkable. I think the transmission, as far as the automatics go, was the best for sure offered from that crop of cars that this thing came out against. Another test that I like to do when I'm reviewing cars is the double pull. Essentially, you're driving at 40 miles an hour and you pull the gear shift twice to downshift. And it did it. There are a lot of cars from this era, and even today, there are a lot of cars where if you pull it twice, sometimes it'll be like, oh, it must have been a mistake. He didn't actually mean to pull it twice. I mean, there are transmissions like the Porsche PDK or whatever that will always give you the gear when you want it. But a lot of them, if you go 1, 2 on a downshift, they just straight up will not give you the gear. And this thing does. So kudos to Lexus on making this fantastic transmission. One of the last things I want to bring up before I end this video is that this car is actually my commuter. And some of you might be thinking, well, if you're talking about how dynamic and how fun it is, then why is it your commuter car that you're just putting miles on? You have to drive one to understand why. My brother, for example, he has a Toyota Corolla. He puts a ton of miles on that and the maintenance is really cheap and he loves that. And he cannot get it through his mind that this is my Corolla because I can put tons of miles on it, the maintenance is super cheap, and when I want to, I've got this massive angry V8 that I can downshift and take off. I can promise you that none of the other cars that this thing competes against is as good at a daily driver / commuter as this car. And moreover, those cars, if you do daily drive them, which I mean, obviously you can, if you do, you're gonna have to spend a good bit of money in the maintenance of those cars. And this thing, you kind of don't. And for all of those reasons, guys, I just love this car. To me, I can relax in it. I can do my 30-minute commute in it. I don't have to worry so much that it's gonna start. I know it's going to start every single time. I know it's gonna get me to work and back. And I know if a car pulls up next to me, I can probably beat them in a drag race too. And that's a really cool feeling these days, especially tied to something that still has analog, hydraulic steering, and a big old V8 up front. In conclusion, I highly recommend this car. If you want a blast from the past with a big V8, high displacement, decent tech, and will always be there for you, I highly recommend it. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching, and we will see you on the next video. Have a good one.